The town of Pale Bend did not take kindly to strangers. The soil was clay-thick and sour underfoot, the hills ringed it like folded hands, and the woods beyond were black with a silence that knew old things. People lived mean and tight in Pale Bend, not from cruelty, but from a long-earned knowledge that mercy cost blood. In the dead center of that town, where Main Street thinned into a curl of mud and bramble, a cabin leaned against the earth like a drunk at a grave. The hearth inside it was cold most days. Ruth Caro kept the fires low, even in the heart of winter, though the bones of her fingers grew stiff and gray with chill. She was a widow long before her time, and her daughter, Mara, was the last living thing she loved. The day Ruth took ill, the sky over Pale Bend yawned open and dropped a rain so hard it peeled bark from trees. She coughed blood into the hem of her dress, stained her pillowcase red. Neighbors did not come. The town had seen sickness before and knew better. They closed their shutters against her screams. Mara was 6 years old and small enough to vanish between the rafters. She nursed her mother with hands too soft to help, fetching water from the swollen creek, placing feverish rags on Ruth's head. In the second week, Ruth's breathing turned wet and thick, as if she were drowning on dry land. She knew she would not live. At night, when Mara slept against her hollow side, Ruth pressed her face into the child's hair and whispered prayers she could not remember the words to. She was not a religious woman, but fear makes a believer of most. On the 13th night, the fever broke Ruth's mind clean in two. She staggered from her bed and pulled up the hearthstones with a strength that should not have been left in her. The earth underneath was raw and red with clay. She clawed at it until her fingernails tore away. Mara watched from the shadows, too frightened to speak. "Come here," Ruth said. Her voice was gentler than it had been in days. Mara went. Ruth kissed her daughter's forehead and laid her into the hollow she had dug. The child did not fight. She was too cold, too tired, and in her heart she trusted that her mother knew best. The hearthstones slid back into place above her. In the thick, red dark, Mara did not cry. She lay still, shallow breathing, the damp earth pressing into her ribs. Overhead she heard her mother singing, ragged, cracked notes, the same lullaby she had sung before the sickness came. Then silence. Outside, the rain swallowed the world. 3 days passed before anyone approached the Caro cabin, not for pity, but for fear the corpse might poison the well water. They found Ruth stiff on the floor, her arms splayed toward the hearth as if she had been crawling toward it. They buried her in the common graveyard, unmarked. The house stood empty after that. No one wanted it. No one wanted the curse they believed she had left behind. Until the man came. He was not from Pale Bend. His coat was a stranger's coat, long and worn, patched with a kind of thread the town's tailor had never touched. His boots were stitched in a style none recognized. He had the look of a man who had seen great ruin and who did not flinch from it. He rode into town with nothing but a mule and a sack slung over his shoulder. The town watched him from behind curtained windows. A few muttered prayers. A few reached for the old charms their grandmothers had hidden under floorboards. The man did not speak. He did not smile. He rode straight to the Caro house and dismounted. The door hung crooked on its hinges. He pushed it open with the toe of his boot. Inside, the air was thick with mold and rot. Something heavier sat beneath it, a sorrow so deep it felt like a second gravity. The man took a slow breath and stepped over the threshold. When night fell, the rain returned, hammering against the sagging roof in fists. The townspeople waited for him to flee or to die, but he lit a fire in the hearth. They saw the smoke rise, thin and wavering, into the weeping sky. Hours passed. Then the crying began. It was not the cry of an old ghost or a beast. It was the soft, broken weeping of a child. It rose up through the rain and the cold and cut the night cleanly in half. The man heard it. He knelt by the hearth, pressing his palm flat against the stones. The weeping grew louder, ragged and desperate, a sound no one alive could fake. The man began to dig. First with his hands, then with a short iron crowbar he pulled from his sack. The stones came up one by one, each groaning as if it carried a century of grief. He scraped away the wet clay with fingers hard as roots. At last the little hand broke free of the earth, white and trembling like a moth's wing. He reached in, pulled the girl from the grave her mother had made. She weighed nothing, her skin was mottled gray and blue, but she was alive. Barely. The man wrapped her in his coat and cradled her against his chest. His heart hammered against her chilled ear. The townsfolk watched from their windows, their mouths open, their hands clutching crosses and rifles alike. The man turned and looked toward them, his face unreadable. He did not speak. He simply carried the child into the dark, away from Pale Bend, leaving behind a house that no one would ever live in again. Far out past the town's edge, where the woods grew thick and wild, the man knelt beside a broken tree and built a fire from splintered branches. He fed the child broth from a tin cup, drop by trembling drop. The girl stared at him with wide, hollow eyes. She did not speak. She could not. The man did not ask her to. He watched the fire, his face carved from stone, and waited for her to choose whether she would live or die. Somewhere beyond the trees, a wolf howled once, long and low. The girl shivered and closed her hand around the hem of the man's coat. He let her. Neither of them spoke a word that night, but something passed between them all the same, a pact older and darker than language. And Pale Bend slept on, ignorant of what it had given birth to in its own poisoned soil. The man did not tell the girl his name. Names had weight. He knew better than to offer that weight to someone still balanced on the knife edge between this world and the next. They traveled by foot through the dense pine, following old hunting trails and game runs carved by animals long gone. The girl moved silently at his side, her bare feet slicing open on stones and thorns, but she never cried. In the mornings, he wrapped strips of cloth around her wounds, binding her to the living earth she no longer trusted. By the end of the first week, she spoke a single word. Hungry. He gave her salted meat, hard and dry, but her hands shook too badly to hold it. He broke it into pieces and placed them on her tongue like a priest delivering communion. In the second week, she asked another word. Why? He had no answer for her, only a hard look and a hand that tightened briefly on her shoulder before letting go. There was no map for where they went, only the cold pull of survival and the understanding that something old and wrong had been stitched into her flesh when her mother buried her under that hearth. At the end of the third week, they reached a crossroads where an abandoned trading post sagged between two dead oaks. The man scavenged there, finding a pair of battered boots for her, a shawl riddled with moth holes, a tin knife with a crooked handle. The girl took the knife without needing to be told. She slept with it clutched under her chin. That night, as the fire guttered low, she spoke again. My mother, she said, voice raw with disuse, put me there. The man did not flinch. He understood that truth needed no comfort. It simply had to be named. She thought it would save you, he said after a long while. The girl stared at the fire until her eyes glazed, her mind sinking back into that last terrible night, the press of clay against her ribs, the slow starvation pulling her apart thread by thread. The man watched her and made no move to pull her out of it. Pain was a forge. He had seen it shape better things than kindness ever had. Before dawn, men found them. Not Pale Bend men, rougher sorts. Bandits who traveled the less patrolled trails between the far settlements, stripping flesh and coin from anyone too weak to stop them. There were 4 of them, hard-eyed and mean, the kind that smiled before they killed. The man rose to meet them with nothing but the crowbar he had used to dig her out of the earth. The girl stood behind him, the crooked knife flashing once in her small fist. The fight was short and brutal. The man moved like a wolf that had been waiting too long to feed, breaking bones with the crowbar's curve, caving skulls with the flat of his boot. Blood misted the cold air, dark as oil. One man lived long enough to grab the girl by the hair and drag her backward. She did not scream. She plunged the knife into the meat of his thigh, twisting hard enough to sever something vital. The man crumpled, wheezing. The stranger did not finish him. He left the wounded man gasping against the roots of a tree, bleeding into the dirt. When the girl wiped the blade clean against her skirts, she did not look away from the body. She watched the life leave it, slow and bitter. The man saw the look in her and did not try to soften it. He only nodded once and kicked dirt over the embers of their fire. By midday, they were moving again. They headed west now, toward country thick with canyonlands and bluffs, where few men traveled and fewer came back. Each night the girl slept lighter. Each morning she rose quicker. The sickness of the earth had not killed her. It had changed her, tempered her into something sharp and cold. She did not laugh, she did not ask questions. She watched and learned. The man showed her how to snare rabbits, how to track by broken twigs and scattered leaves. He taught her to listen for the things that did not sound right in the woods, the quiet that came before ambush, the cry of a crow where there should have been none. She learned, faster than he expected. She moved with a grace that unsettled even him sometimes, her small frame slipping through the trees like smoke. On the 5th week, they came to a ridge where the land broke open into a long valley scorched black by an old fire. At the far end, a trading town squatted against the horizon, its buildings new and sharp-edged. The man stopped there. He looked down at her, at the thin outline of a child who was no longer only a child. "You can go on," he said, "or you can stay." Her voice was stronger now. It carried weight. "Which way did they come from?" she asked. The man smiled, though it was a thin, broken thing. She had understood already. Pale Bend lay behind them, rotting in its own cowardice. But the world that had made her mother desperate enough to bury her alive, the world that let men ride roughshod over the weak, that fed on silence and fear, that world stretched wide in every direction. She would not run from it. She would shape it. She chose the path that led into the valley. The man followed. As the sun set behind them, the girl looked back once at the wilderness they had crossed. Then she pulled the crooked knife from her belt, held it to the last light of day, and marked the skin of her arm with a shallow cut. Not deep enough to cripple, just enough to remember. When the blood welled, she rubbed it into the hilt of her blade and kept walking. In the dying light, she left no shadow. Only the faint drag of broken earth behind her, and the long patience of something that had once been buried and would not stay dead. The valley town was called Mercy's End, though there was nothing merciful about it. It had grown fast and ugly off the back of a silver strike that had long since dried up. What was left behind were brothels, saloons, and men who wore their guns like second mouths. The man and the girl arrived with no fanfare. No one in Mercy's End asked questions unless they were paid for the answers. The girl took work where she could, cleaning, fetching, mending. Small, dirty jobs that let her listen. The man watched from the shadows, nursing a bottle more often than not, but his eyes never left her. He was waiting, though even he might not have known for what. In the evenings, the girl sat in the back rooms of the saloon, polishing glasses or sweeping splinters from the floor. She listened to the drunks talk. Names, deeds, old scores that had been settled with fire and rope. She learned who held the power here. 3 names surfaced over and over, like bones caught in a river current. Coleman Vance, who owned the timber rights and 3/4 of the town's men by debt. Emmett Stray, who ran the saloon and half the sheriff's office. And Margaret Keene, a widow who controlled the brothels and wasn't afraid to bleed anyone who crossed her. They had carved Mercy's End into a graveyard with living walls, and anyone who wanted a piece of it had to crawl over bodies to claim it. The girl learned their faces before she learned their voices. She learned how Margaret Keene wore black even on the hottest days, a pearl-handled derringer tucked in the folds of her skirts. She learned how Vance rode with 2 gun hands always behind him, boys with dead eyes and quick fingers. She learned how Emmett Stray laughed whenever he killed a man, as if each death was a joke only he understood. She kept her head down. She waited. The man did not tell her when the waiting was done. He only left a small bundle by her bedside one night. Inside was a pistol, short-barreled and heavy, wrapped in old cloth, not new but clean, well-loved. There was no note. There didn't need to be. The next morning, she was gone. She started with the dogs. Mercy's End had dozens of them, half-wild things that ran in packs through the alleys, biting children, dragging trash through the streets. Stray had once placed bets on how many dogs a man could kill in an hour. She hunted them at night, swift and silent, laying poisoned scraps along their trails, cutting throats when she could get close enough. No one noticed at first. No one cared. But when the dogs were gone, the rats came. And when the rats came, the sickness followed. People began dying by the handful, first the weak, then the strong. The town boiled with fear. Preachers howled about sin and repentance. Gunslingers fled for richer, healthier towns. The girl watched from the edges, unseen, patient. Vance called meetings in the old church, demanding order. Stray hired men to patrol the streets, rougher and more desperate than before. Margaret Keene tightened her grip, her girls locked inside, her thugs on every corner. The girl moved among them like smoke. She poisoned the well behind Vance's timber yard, using herbs she found in the hills. She cut the girths on Stray's horses, sent his riders crashing into dust. She whispered lies in the ears of Keene's men, setting them against each other with careful, bloodless words. One night, she left a single thing on the doorstep of the saloon. A hearthstone. No name, no threat. Just the stone, stained with the faint memory of old earth. The town felt the chill of it. Whispers spread faster than the sickness ever had. Some said the girl was a spirit, a curse laid down by the Carrows themselves. Others said she was flesh and blood, a child raised wrong, fed on grave dirt and vengeance. The man said nothing. He watched the town turn on itself and kept his bottle close. He had taught her all he could. The rest was up to her. The final stroke came one bitter, gray morning when the wind changed. Someone found Emmett Stray hanging from the bell tower, a rope carved from the same kind of fabric Ruth Carrow had once used to sew Mara's dresses. His body twisted in the wind, his boots tapping against the tower's wood like a slow, mocking drum. Margaret Keene found herself cornered in her own brothel. Her girls turned against her with knives in their hands, their faces pale with rage and sorrow. Vance tried to flee, but his own men dragged him back, desperate for someone to blame. They beat him in the streets until the blood soaked through the dust and left a black stain no rain would wash clean. The town broke open like a rotted fruit. And through it all, the girl walked untouched, her boots quiet against the stones. She had no need for a speech. No need for a crown. She claimed mercy's end not with fire and banners, but with silence. A silence that weighed heavier than any scream. At dusk, when the last cries died away, she sat by the ruined well and wiped her crooked knife clean one final time. The man came to her there, his shadow long in the setting sun. He crouched beside her, cracked a brittle smile, and passed her a silver dollar. "For the ferryman," he said. She closed her fingers around it without speaking. Together they sat until the stars scraped their cold light across the heavens, and Mercy's end lay dead and still behind them. Only then did the girl speak, her voice so soft it barely stirred the air. "Not enough." The man nodded. There were other towns, other debts, other hearthstones waiting to be overturned. The girl stood and walked into the darkness without looking back. The man followed, a step behind. Their path was long, and the world was full of sins waiting to be paid for. They traveled north where the land climbed into ragged hills and the wind smelled of iron. The settlements there were meaner, poorer, stitched together from the bones of failed dreams. Men lived harder in that country, and they died quicker. The girl, though she was no longer quite a girl, shed the last scraps of her childhood without ceremony. Her frame grew wiry, her gaze sharpened until it cut. She spoke little, and when she did, her words weighed more than a grown man's oath. The man aged too, his steps slowed, his breathing thickened, but he did not falter. It was as if some old, unspoken duty chained him to her side, as if he knew he would not see the end of the trail they had set themselves upon. They came to a place called Rook's Hollow, where the dead were cheaper than a bottle of whiskey. Rook's Hollow was ruled by a family named the Barrows. 5 brothers and their father, a gang of beasts who ground the town under their boothiels. They took land, daughters, and lives with the lazy cruelty of men who had never been denied. The girl watched them for a week from the rotted loft of a livery stable. She watched how the Barrows sat like kings on the sagging porch of the saloon, how the townsfolk crossed the street rather than meet their eyes. She studied their weaknesses the way a vulture studies a wounded horse. The eldest brother, Ward, drank himself blind every second night and liked to pull the hair of the girls he paid for. The youngest, Eli, still had the clumsy swagger of a boy who thought he could not be hurt. Their father, Amos Barrow, was a harder thing to read. He moved less than the others, spoke less, but his silence was a different breed from the town's submission. It was the silence of a man who had killed often enough that he no longer needed to announce it. The girl knew she could not take them in the open. So she hunted small first. She poisoned their horses, a slow rot that made the beasts wild-eyed and dangerous. She salted their wells. She paid 2 drunks to brawl in front of the saloon and set a fire while the town's few lawmen were distracted. Each cut she made was deep enough to blade, but shallow enough that the Barrows did not yet know who held the knife. When the town's storehouse burned, Ward Barrow dragged the blacksmith's boy into the square and beat him until his teeth lay scattered across the dirt. No one stopped him. The girl watched from the shadow of a broken wall, her face carved into stillness. The man sat beside her, sharpening a blade that had seen too much work. "You ready?" he asked. Her voice was a splinter. "I been ready." That night they moved. The second brother, Caleb, was the first to fall. They found him slumped in the back alley behind the saloon, a knife punched up under his jaw, his mouth open in a frozen scream. The third brother, Micah, disappeared during a hunting trip into the woods. Only his boots were ever found, nailed to the door of the Barrow family house. Ward and Eli raged through the streets like kicked dogs, guns blazing at shadows. The girl let them. Fear was a weapon sharper than steel. When Ward Barrow finally found her, it was not by wit, but by luck. She had gone to the river to wash blood from her hands, and he caught her reflection in the water. He charged, roaring, too drunk and too angry to see the trap she had laid. The rope around his ankle yanked him backward, snapping his leg like a stick. He screamed, a high, broken sound, but the girl stood over him silent as judgment. "You know me?" she asked. He spat blood and curses, called her every foul thing his mother had ever whispered to him. She knelt, laid the crooked knife against his throat. "Not enough," she said, and pulled. The river carried his blood away in slow ribbons. She left him there for the others to find. When Amos Barrow saw what had been done to his sons, he did not send riders after her. He sent a message. A girl, half-starved and filthy, staggering into the edge of camp with a white flag stitched into her skirts. Pinned to her chest was a single hearthstone. The man caught her as she fell. She was not dead yet, but close. The message was clear enough. Come back or more would die. The girl did not flinch. She wiped the soot from her blade, buckled the pistol at her side, and stood. The man blocked her path, for the first and only time. "You go in there," he said. "You might not come back." She looked past him to the town crouching in the hollow, lights burning spiteful in the dark. "I wasn't meant to come back," she said. The man bowed his head. He knew he could not follow her this time. He had only ever been the hand that dug her out of the ground. The rest had always been hers. She walked into Rook's Hollow alone. No one saw her slip between the buildings. No one saw the shadows peel away from her path. She found Amos Barrow waiting for her in the square, 2 rifles across his lap, and a smile like a noose. "I been expecting you," he said. The girl said nothing. The hollow filled with townsfolk drawn by the scent of something about to die. Their faces were pale blurs in the dark, their fear thick enough to taste. "You want blood, little crow," Amos said, rising slow. "You'll drown in it." The girl raised her pistol. The first shot took his left eye. The second tore through his knee. He collapsed, roaring. The girl did not rush him. She walked, each step measured, each breath steady. She knelt when she reached him, so close she could smell the whiskey and bile on his breath. "You buried me," she said, the words scraping up from somewhere deep inside her. Amos Barrow gurgled, reaching for a knife at his belt. She knocked it away with the toe of her boot. "You buried me," she said again, softer now, as if the truth was a thing that needed to be whispered. "And now you can stay down." She plunged the crooked knife into the hollow of his throat. The light went out of him slow, stubborn. When it was done, she stood. The people of Rook's Hollow stared at her, silent. She looked over them, her face unreadable. There was no cheer, no applause. Only the creak of the wind through broken shutters and the slow understanding settling into their bones. The girl did not belong to the earth anymore. She belonged to whatever waited under it. She turned and walked away, leaving the body to rot where it fell. At the edge of town, the man was waiting. He did not smile. He only tipped his hat back and said, "You're ready now." The girl nodded once, slow. There was more work to be done, and the world was still full of hearthstones waiting to be overturned. They left Rook's Hollow before the sun touched the rooftops. The man's mule carried what little they owned. The girl walked ahead, boots raising dust from the brittle ground, the crooked knife hidden in the folds of her belt. The man's steps were slower than before. His breath rattled in his chest some nights, and once he coughed a string of dark blood into his sleeve. He said nothing of it, neither did she. They crossed into badlands where even the scrub died thirsty. For days they saw no one but vultures circling, riding the heat. The girl grew leaner still. The man shrank into himself, a scarecrow of bone and old leather. On the seventh night, the man did not rise from his bedroll. The girl found him lying still, his hat pulled low, his crowbar laid across his chest like a sword buried with a king. She sat beside him until the stars paled. When the coyotes howled, she buried him in the dry riverbed with her own hands, piling stones over him until her fingers bled. No prayers. No words. Only the silence he had given her, heavier now than any grief. She took his crowbar. She left the mule. She walked. Weeks passed, maybe months, time wore thin. The girl, no longer a girl, not by any word that mattered, drifted from place to place, a ghost that towns refused to name. She followed rumors carried on broken teeth and drunken songs. Stories of men who beat children in the streets. Stories of women sold across rivers like cattle. Stories of towns where the law was a brand burned into skin. Everywhere she went, the stories ended the same. A body found under a hearthstone. A well poisoned. A knife buried deep in the throat of a man who thought himself untouchable. The ones who survived whispered about her. They called her the Hearthborn, the girl from under the stone, the crow's daughter. No one knew her name, not anymore. It had been buried with the woman who had once laid her in the earth out of love and desperation. Some said she was hunting for something that could never be found. Some said she was searching for a place that could never exist. She knew better. She was not searching. She was stitching the world back together with blood and silence, thread by ragged thread. One evening, she came to a town so small it had no name. The houses leaned inward as if bracing against some long-forgotten sorrow. The fields lay fallow. The well was dry. There was a church barely standing. Its cross was broken, its doors hanging open like a wound. Children huddled inside, their faces hollow, their eyes too old. No men guarded them, no women soothed them. Only a few ragged girls barely older than herself, arms wrapped around younger ones, as if they could hold back the slow dying with nothing but thin hands. The girl stood at the threshold. A child ran to her, thin as a stalk, eyes wide with a hope that should not have survived this far. "Are you her?" the child asked. The girl said nothing. Hope was a dangerous thing. A voice cracked from the shadows behind the altar. You come looking for what's left. An old man leaned against the rotting wood, a rifle sagging in his hands. His body was brittle, but his voice carried the cold certainty of a grave being filled. We sent for help, none came, only you. The girl stepped forward, her shadow stretching across the warped floorboards. What happened? The old man spat into the dust. Riders took what they wanted, burned what they didn't. He looked past her toward the door, as if expecting the world to end. They'll be back come the next full moon, take the rest. The children shrank into themselves. The girl listened. The wind rattled broken glass in the windows. She laid the crowbar and the crooked knife at her feet. She stripped off the worn coat, the boots, the belt. She moved like a soldier, preparing for a war that would not leave any side standing. The old man watched her. You alone. She picked up the knife, weighed it in her palm. No, she said, voice low and sure. Not anymore. When the riders came, they found the town silent. No banners. No lines of defense. Only empty streets and the hollow moan of the wind. They laughed. They rode in easy. The girl watched from the broken church steeple, knife clenched between her teeth, crowbar in hand. When she moved fast. When she struck to kill. She was not made for mercy. She was made for endings. The riders fell one by one, their blood soaking into the dust that had already buried so many forgotten dead. When the last one gurgled his life into the stones, the girl stood in the center of the street, soaked to the elbows, chest heaving. The children crept from the church. They looked at her not with fear, but with something worse. Reverence. She dropped the crowbar. It struck the ground with a sound that echoed up into the barren hills. The girl fell to her knees. For the first time in too many seasons to count, she cried. Not for herself, not for the dead, but for the ones who would have no one left to save them when she was gone. She pressed her forehead to the earth. She kissed the blood-stained stones. She knew now what the man had known when he dug her free. Some things could never be unburied. Some wounds were meant to stay open. When the dawn rose, it found her sitting on the church steps, children huddled against her sides, asleep at last. The sun burned away the night. The girl from under the hearth did not move. She watched the world wake with dry, empty eyes. There were no more hearthstones to overturn. No more graves to dig. Only the long, slow breath of a land that had forgotten how to heal. She would wait. And if darkness came again, if the riders returned, she would rise. Not because she was born to save them, but because she had been made to endure. And the earth, red, bitter, unforgiving, would remember her. Long after the names were gone, long after the stones had crumbled, the girl would endure. Because some things buried in the dark do not die. They grow.